Helen stared at the unpaid pharmacy bill, the lie Tracy had told her glaring in cold, bold ink. Mark had stayed silent, letting Tracy push her further. Helen's hand tightened around the checkbook hidden upstairs, her lifeline, her power. Tracy had no idea what was coming next. As her daughter-in-law screamed for answers, Helen knew this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about taking control back. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Helen Whitaker had just stepped into the hallway, her pill bottle rattling faintly in her palm, when she heard Tracy's voice slice through the stillness of the house. The words were sharp, tossed casually like scraps on the floor, but they landed heavy in Helen's chest. Why waste money on her medicine? The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was cruel enough to stop Helen in her tracks. Her hand tightened around the little orange bottle until the plastic pressed hard into her palm. For a second she forgot to breathe. Mark's voice came next, softer, uneasy. "Tracy, don't." But that was all. He didn't finish. He didn't defend. Helen leaned against the wall, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. The faint scent of fried onions still hung in the air from dinner, mixing with the lemon cleaner Tracy always overused. But everything suddenly felt sour. She stared at the pill bottle, at her lifeline reduced to a line item Tracy thought could be erased. She turned the corner slowly, her slippers whispering against the hardwood, but neither of them noticed her. Tracy was scrolling on her phone, smirking. Mark just looked tired, shoulders slumped, his wedding band glinting under the kitchen light as he rubbed the back of his neck. Helen wanted to scream, wanted to slam the bottle on the counter and demand answers, but instead she drew in a breath, steadied her trembling hands and said quietly, "I think I'll head to bed early." Tracy barely looked up. "Sure, Helen." Mark gave a weak smile, but his eyes slid away. Upstairs, behind the safety of her bedroom door, Helen set the pill bottle on her nightstand and sat on the edge of her bed. The house creaked as it settled, a sound that once comforted her, but now pressed against her chest like weight. She picked up her phone and scrolled to Gloria's number. The moment she heard her best friend's familiar gravelly voice, Helen's composure cracked. "Gloria," she whispered, fighting to keep her voice steady. "You won't believe what I just heard." Gloria Benson, who had been her anchor through widowhood, wasted no time. "Tell me." Helen recounted every word, every tone, every silence that followed. When she finished, there was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Don't let them control your lifeline," Gloria said firmly. "Your health isn't theirs to decide. You hear me, Helen? Don't you dare hand that power over." The strength in Gloria's voice steadied her. Helen pressed a tissue to her damp cheeks and nodded, even though Gloria couldn't see her. "I hear you. Good. You've got more backbone than you realize. Use it." After hanging up, Helen turned off her bedside lamp, but sleep didn't come. Instead, her mind replayed Tracy's words over and over, each echo a reminder that silence had allowed this contempt to grow unchecked. She rose, padding barefoot across the carpet to her file drawer. The metal handle felt cold against her fingers as she slid it open. Neat rows of folders stared back at her, medical forms, pension papers, and years of careful records. She shuffled through until her hand landed on the envelope she had been thinking about all night. Bank papers. Her name in bold letters. Accounts Tracy didn't know as much about as she believed. Helen traced the embossed logo on the envelope, her lips tightening into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't defeat either. From downstairs she heard muffled voices, Tracy's laugh cutting through again. But Helen wasn't listening anymore. Her fingers tightened around the papers, her heart finally slowing to a steady beat. If Tracy thought she could choke off her medicine, she had another thing coming. And as Helen closed the drawer, the thought pressed itself clear as glass in her mind. She was about to remind them exactly whose money kept this household alive. Helen sat at her kitchen table the next morning, sunlight slanting across the wood in thin golden stripes. The house was quiet. Tracy had gone to her spin class, and Mark had left for work. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator filled the room. Helen laid the manila envelope flat on the table, her fingertips brushing the flap like it might burn her. She slipped the papers free. Neatly stapled statements, balances, and notes spilled across the table, the smell of ink and paper strangely grounding. She reached for her reading glasses, her hands steady now, sharper than they had been in weeks. Line by line she studied. There it was, the household joint account, her son's name beside her own, Tracy's name added later, the ink almost smug where it sat on the page. Helen's lips thinned. That was the account Tracy hovered over, where grocery bills and mortgage payments went. Tracy thought it gave her control, but Helen's eyes moved down the sheet. Another account, hers alone. Pension deposits landing each month like clockwork. A savings line she had built carefully, small by small, since before Tracy ever came into the picture. The balances weren't extravagant, but they were hers, and no one could touch them. The faint scent of last night's coffee drifted up from her mug as she leaned back in her chair, letting the realization sink in. She wasn't trapped. She wasn't powerless. Still, she needed assurance. She pulled her phone from her sweater pocket and scrolled to Edward Grant's number. He answered on the second ring, his calm baritone instantly easing the stiffness in her chest. "Edward, it's Helen. I have a question about my accounts." "Of course," he said. She could hear faint classical music in the background, the steady click of his pen. "Tell me what's going on," she explained, slow and precise, how Tracy hovered over the joint account, and how silence from Mark had only worsened her unease. When she mentioned the separate accounts, her voice grew steadier, more certain. Edward chuckled softly, not unkindly. "Helen, you still have full authority. No one can move a dime from your pension or savings without you. The joint account is shared, yes, but your individual accounts are untouchable. The law is clear on that." Helen pressed the phone closer to her ear, drinking in every word. "So I'm not at their mercy." "You're not," he confirmed. "In fact, you're in an excellent position to protect yourself. I can draft whatever safeguards you need." After the call, she sat a little taller. Her reflection in the window didn't look so frail anymore. It looked alert, calculating. When Gloria arrived that afternoon with her usual burst of perfume and chatter, Helen poured them both tea and slid the papers across the table. Gloria scanned them quickly, her sharp eyes narrowing in satisfaction. "Well, well," Gloria said, setting her teacup down with a thud. "Time to teach them the cost of cruelty." Helen allowed herself a small smile. The bitterness of Tracy's words still clung to her, but it no longer paralyzed her. Now it fueled her. The house stayed quiet until dusk. Helen read in her armchair, the tick of the grandfather clock marking each calm second. She almost convinced herself the storm had passed, until her phone buzzed against the side table. A new message. From Tracy. Helen opened it, her jaw tightening. "Don't forget," the text read. "I'm picking up the checkbook tomorrow." Helen lowered the phone slowly, her eyes narrowing as the glow of the screen faded. The game, it seemed, was just beginning. The morning light crept into the Whitaker kitchen in thin beams, painting the tile floor pale gold. Helen stood at the counter, the household checkbook in her hands, its leather cover worn soft from years of use. For decades this book had felt like a tool of order and stability. Today it felt like a weapon she couldn't leave unguarded. She slid it into her desk drawer upstairs, then turned the key in the lock until it clicked. The metallic sound carried a strange satisfaction, final, resolute. She tucked the key on a ribbon inside her blouse, resting warm against her chest. By mid-morning the front door creaked open. Tracy breezed in, sunglasses perched on her head, her perfume sharp and citrusy. She dropped her tote bag onto the bench, with a thud. "Where's the checkbook, Helen?" she asked, her tone already tinged with impatience. Helen looked up from her crossword puzzle, her pen tapping once against the paper before she answered. "I'll handle the bills myself from now on." Tracy's eyebrows arched high. "Excuse me." Helen kept her voice even. "I've managed money longer than you've been in this family. It's simpler if I take care of it directly." The air between them tightened, as though even the walls leaned in to listen. Tracy's lips pressed into a thin line, her nostrils flaring just enough to betray her anger. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, choosing silence over the outburst. Helen could feel trembling just beneath the surface. Fine, Tracy said finally, each letter clipped like glass underfoot. She snatched her tote bag from the bench, the perfume cloud trailing her as she stormed into the other room. Helen didn't move. She simply adjusted her glasses and returned to her puzzle, her steady pen scratching across the page, a quiet act of defiance. Later that afternoon, Helen met Gloria at their favorite cafe downtown. The place smelled of roasted coffee beans and cinnamon rolls, and the windows were fogged slightly from the ovens in back. Gloria was already seated, a slice of cherry pie in front of her, her lipstick leaving a red print on the fork. "Well?" Gloria asked, eyes sparkling with mischief. Helen leaned in, lowering her voice. "She came for the checkbook. I told her I'd handle the bills myself." Gloria slapped the table lightly, laughing loud enough to draw a glance from the barista. "Good for you." I wish I'd seen her face. Helen allowed herself a small smile. She wasn't pleased. "Let her stew," Gloria said, stabbing her fork into the pie. "Now what's next?" Helen's eyes drifted to the cafe's window, where people bustled along the street, free and unbothered. She wanted that same ease, that same independence. "The bank. I need to make sure they can't touch what's mine." Gloria nodded. "And I'll go with you." "No one pushes Helen Whitaker around. Not with me on watch." The two women clinked their coffee cups like a toast, the sound crisp and decisive. As Helen returned home that evening, the weight of the checkbook's absence still hung in the air. She could almost hear Tracy pacing upstairs, muttering, her footsteps sharp against the floorboards. But Helen didn't waver. For the first time in weeks, she felt control slipping back into her own hands. Her phone buzzed just as she was settling into her chair. A number she recognized, the local bank branch. "Mrs. Whitaker," came a woman's calm voice. "This is Lydia Chen, the branch manager. I've reviewed your file and I think it would be best if we scheduled a private meeting to discuss your accounts. Would you be available tomorrow?" Helen felt her pulse quicken. The path forward was opening, one locked door at a time. "Yes," she answered softly, her lips curling into the faintest of smiles. Helen pushed open the heavy glass doors of the downtown Cincinnati bank, the whoosh of air conditioning meeting her like a cool hand on her cheek. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and new paper, a mixture that had always made her feel like things were orderly, safe. A young teller greeted her with a professional smile, but Helen didn't stop. She walked with measured steps toward the offices in back, her handbag pressed close to her side. When she reached the frosted glass door marked Lydia Chen, branch manager, she tapped lightly. "Come in," a voice called. Inside, Lydia rose from behind her desk, her navy blazer crisp, her dark hair neatly pulled into a bun. Her expression softened instantly when she saw Helen. "Mrs. Whitaker, please, sit." Helen settled into the leather chair, the faint creak beneath her reminding her of how long she'd carried this weight. She opened her purse, pulled out the folded statements, and laid them on the desk. Her fingers lingered on the edges of the paper before she spoke. "I need to make some changes." Quietly, Lydia leaned forward, resting her hands on the desk. "Tell me what's going on." So Helen did. She didn't rush. Her voice stayed calm, even as she recounted Tracy's words, the unpaid pharmacy bill, the attempts to control the checkbook. Each detail seemed to sharpen Lydia's focus, her brows tightening slightly, her pen poised but not moving. When Helen finished, there was silence for a beat, only the faint hum of the office clock filling the air. "You don't need to worry," Lydia said finally, her voice even but firm. "Everything you've told me stays between us. You still have complete control over your personal accounts. If you'd like, we can remove any additional access on your joint accounts. No one, not even family, has the right to override your decisions." Helen's chest loosened, a weight lifting she hadn't realized had settled so deep. She nodded once. "That's exactly what I want." They worked through the paperwork together, Lydia sliding forms across the desk with a kind of precision that gave Helen comfort. With each signature, she felt more of the rope Tracy had knotted around her slipping loose. When they reached the section for emergency contacts, Helen paused. "Gloria Benson," she said firmly, spelling out her friend's name. Lydia typed it in, her nails clicking softly against the keyboard. "Done. If anything happens, she'll be notified. Not your son, not his wife." Helen's lips pressed into the faintest of smiles. "Thank you." By the time they finished, nearly an hour had passed, yet Helen felt lighter than she had in years. She stood, smoothing her skirt, her reflection in the glass door looking sharper, steadier. "Mrs. Whitaker," Lydia said before she left, "you did the right thing. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." The words carried with Helen as she walked back through the lobby, the sound of her sensible shoes striking the polished floor like punctuation marks. Outside, the late afternoon sun spilled over the street, warm against her skin. For the first time in weeks, the future didn't look like a narrowing hallway. It looked open. That evening, Helen sat at the dinner table, the familiar clatter of silverware filling the kitchen. Tracy chatted idly about a boutique sale, her bracelets jangling as she gestured. Mark passed the bread basket without looking up. Helen cut her chicken quietly, savoring each bite as though it tasted of victory. Then Mark's voice broke through, casual, almost careless. "Mom," he said, spearing a green bean with his fork, "did you move some money around today?" The fork in Helen's hand froze midair, the question hanging heavy in the air between them. Helen set her fork down, meeting her son's eyes across the dinner table. Mark's voice had carried that off-handed edge, but his question cut deeper than he realized. "Did you move some money around today?" The clink of Tracy's bracelets filled the silence as she poured herself another glass of iced tea, pretending disinterest, but her eyes flicked sideways, sharp and waiting. Helen offered a mild smile, tilting her head just slightly. "Just making sure everything is in order, dear. You know me, I like to keep my accounts tidy." Mark shrugged, half satisfied, half uneasy, and turned his attention back to his plate. Tracy stabbed at her salad a little too forcefully, the metal tines screeching faintly against porcelain. Helen resumed eating, her calm mask unbroken, but beneath the table her hand brushed the folded receipts in her sweater pocket. Every withdrawal, every transfer documented and tucked safely away in her locked drawer upstairs. Careless, she was not. 2 days later, she sat across from Edward Grant in his office. The scent of leather and old books filled the room, his shelves lined with neat rows of case law. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents Lydia had provided before sliding a fresh stack of paperwork across the desk. "This will make it airtight," Edward said. "You'll retain full authority over your assets, no ambiguity. If anyone tries to intervene, legally or otherwise, they won't have a leg to stand on." Helen gripped the pen, her hand steady as she signed. Each stroke felt like cutting away another strand of Tracy's imagined web. Edward smiled faintly. "That's one less thing for them to dangle over you." Later that afternoon, Gloria swept into Helen's living room, carrying a bakery box that smelled of cinnamon and sugar. She set it down with a dramatic flourish and threw her arms wide. "To freedom," she declared before laughing and collapsing onto the couch. Helen chuckled, easing beside her. "It's just paperwork, Gloria. It's one step toward freedom." Gloria countered, pulling out 2 pastries and handing one over. "Paperwork is how the powerful win." They ate in companionable silence, the sound of flaky crusts crackling beneath their bites. For the first time in weeks, Helen let herself relax into the sweetness, savoring it like a promise. But peace was short-lived. That evening at dinner, Tracy's voice slithered into the quiet like smoke. "Funny," she muttered, not looking up from her plate, "seems like some funds went missing. Maybe banks make mistakes these days." Her words hung in the air, sharp as broken glass. Helen lifted her fork, cut into her slice of pie, and placed it calmly into her mouth. The rich chocolate melted on her tongue, smooth and steady, as if Tracy hadn't spoken at all. Mark fidgeted beside his wife, his eyes darting between them, but he said nothing. Helen dabbed her lips with her napkin, her movements deliberate, serene. "This dessert is wonderful," she said mildly. "Reminds me of the cafe downtown." Tracy's jaw tightened, but she kept silent. The rest of the meal passed in brittle quiet, the clatter of utensils against china louder than conversation. That night, after the dishes were done, and the house settled into uneasy stillness, Helen sat in her armchair with the lamp casting a warm pool of light across her lap. She leafed through her folder of receipts, each slip of paper a small shield of proof. Tracy could mutter all she wanted. Helen's records told the truth. Her phone buzzed on the side table, vibrating against the wood. She picked it up, expecting a message from Gloria. Instead, it was a call. "Mrs. Whitaker." Lydia Chen's voice carried urgency, low and clipped. "Do you know Tracy tried to access your account today?" Helen's breath caught, the papers slipping from her lap onto the floor. The battle wasn't just simmering in her dining room anymore. It had reached the bank. Helen pressed the phone tighter against her ear. Lydia's words sinking in like stones dropped into water. "Stormed in," Lydia continued, her tone steady, professional, but edged with disbelief. "She demanded we give her access, insisted you'd authorized her. When my staff refused," she raised her voice, "I had to step in myself." Helen's lips curved into something between a smirk and a sigh. She leaned back in her chair, the lamplight casting her shadow against the living room wall. "That sounds like her." On the other end, Lydia's voice softened. "I want to assure you, the block is airtight. She can't touch a cent. We'll document today's incident for our records, but you don't have to worry. Not about this." For the first time since overhearing Tracy's cruel words in the kitchen, Helen chuckled. It slipped out, dry but genuine. "I imagine she didn't appreciate being told no." "You could say that," Lydia replied, amusement threading her calm professionalism. "But rules are rules, and you set them, Mrs. Whitaker. Not her." Helen ended the call with a thank you, and sat still for a moment, the quiet of the house wrapping around her. The tick of the grandfather clock marked the moment like punctuation. When Gloria dropped by the next morning, carrying a paper bag that smelled of fresh bagels, Helen wasted no time sharing the news. "She tried the bank." Gloria's voice rang with outrage and delight all at once. She plopped onto the couch, tearing open the bag, and tossing a sesame bagel onto a napkin for Helen. "That woman's got nerve. But you've got her beat." Helen spread cream cheese carefully across the warm bread, the simple action grounding her. "Lydia said the block is solid. Tracy has no path in." Gloria lifted her coffee in a toast. To closed doors, they laughed together, the sound filling the house more warmly than any heater could. Helen took a bite, savoring both the crisp crust and the relief curling in her chest. For the first time in weeks, the world didn't feel like it was pressing against her. She was pressing back. That evening, however, tension seeped back in like a draft. Dinner was a quieter affair than usual. Tracy moved about the kitchen with clipped movements, her bracelets jingling like distant warning bells. She said little, but her silence was sharp, barbed. Mark, meanwhile, looked restless. He pushed peas across his plate, cleared his throat, and finally asked, his tone cautious, "Mom, why is Tracy so upset with the bank?" Helen dabbed her mouth with her napkin, placing it carefully on the table before answering. Her voice was calm, almost light. "You'll have to ask your wife about that." Mark shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking toward Tracy, who glared at her plate as though it might confess on her behalf. The rest of the meat dragged on in uneasy silence, the sound of forks against china scraping like dull knives. Helen ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it were proof of her quiet victory. Later that night, when the dishes were done, and she had retreated to her room, Helen found an envelope propped against her door. No note, just the pharmacy's logo stamped in blue across the front. Her stomach tightened as she slid a finger under the flap. Inside, the bill was crisp, the ink fresh. A balance due, unpaid. Helen's pulse quickened. Tracy had promised to handle her prescriptions, yet here it was, unpaid, threatening the very medicine that kept her heart steady. She sat on the edge of her bed, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. This wasn't an oversight. No, this was Tracy, playing with her lifeline again, and this time Helen knew she would have to act before it was too late. Helen sat at her desk the next morning, the pharmacy bill spread flat before her. Tracy's neat lie, that she had been paying it, crumbled with every line of ink on the page. Helen pulled out her own checkbook, the one she had locked away, and uncapped her pen. Her hand didn't tremble. She wrote the amounts slowly, with deliberate strokes, each loop of her cursive a quiet act of rebellion. The sound of the pen scratching across paper was steady, determined. When she signed her name, it felt like a seal of survival. By late afternoon, Helen drove herself to the pharmacy. The automatic doors slid open, releasing a faint medicinal smell mixed with something floral from a display of hand lotions. The fluorescent lights glared down, sterile and bright, but Helen stood tall as she approached the counter. The pharmacist, a young man with wire-rimmed glasses, smiled politely. "Mrs. Whitaker, we've got your refill ready." Helen slid the check across the counter. "This is to settle the bill. From now on, you'll take payments directly from me. No one else." He glanced at the check, then back at her. Of course, his tone carried respect, even admiration. When the small white bag of pills was placed in her hands, she held it like treasure. The crinkle of the paper against her palm was the sound of victory. She slipped it carefully into her purse, her chest lifting with a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Before leaving, she pulled out her phone and dialed Lydia at the bank. "I need every pharmacy payment routed through me," Helen said firmly. "Consider it done," Lydia replied without hesitation. "Your accounts, your rules." Helen smiled as she stepped back into the crisp evening air. Back home, Gloria was waiting on the porch, wrapped in a red cardigan, her hair tousled by the breeze. When Helen showed her the white pharmacy bag, Gloria's face lit up. "You did it," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around Helen. The hug was warm, perfumed faintly with Gloria's lavender soap. "You're keeping yourself alive, and that's the biggest win." Helen laughed softly, a sound edged with relief. "I wasn't about to let her take this from me." That night at dinner, the weight of the small pill bottle in Helen's pocket gave her strength. She placed it on the counter before eating, not hiding it. Mark noticed. His fork slowed against his plate, his eyes flicking between the bottle and his mother. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His guilt was visible in the slump of his shoulders, in the way he chewed without tasting. Tracy, however, didn't bother with subtlety. She glared at Helen across the table, her eyes cold, her lips pressed so tightly they paled at the edges. She didn't say a word, but her silence was sharper than anything she could have voiced. Helen ate calmly, savoring each bite. The rhythm of knife against plate was her steady drumbeat of defiance. After dinner, when the house had quieted, Helen settled into her armchair. She reached for her phone to check a message from Gloria, but another notification lit the screen first. A social media post. Tracy's. The words glared back at her in bold type. "Some people don't know when to step aside." Helen's lips pressed into a thin line as she stared at the screen. Tracy wasn't just whispering her venom anymore, she was broadcasting it. Helen stared at the glowing phone screen, Tracy's words still burning in her vision. The message wasn't cloaked in subtlety, it was a dagger, aimed straight at her. But if Tracy wanted an audience, Helen would give her one. With steady hands, Helen pressed the buttons to take a screenshot. The shutter sound snapped in the quiet living room, like the cocking of a gun. She saved it, then saved it again, tucking copies into multiple folders on her phone. No matter how fast Tracy deleted it later, the words were hers forever. The next morning, Helen sat across from Edward in his office. The blinds were half drawn, filtering sunlight into soft golden stripes across the polished desk. Edward adjusted his tie, peered at her phone screen and leaned closer. "She really posted this." His voice was even, but his brows arched. Helen turned the phone so he could see. "Right here." Time-stamped, public. Edward reached for a leather-bound folder, slipped the printed screenshot she'd brought into a clear sleeve, and tapped it into place. This goes into the file. If she tries to challenge your decisions, financial, medical, or otherwise, we have evidence of hostility. It demonstrates intent. Judges don't like hostility in family matters. Helen exhaled slowly, the knot between her ribs loosening just a fraction. So I'm not just imagining things. It's useful. Very, Edward said, meeting her eyes. Sometimes people hang themselves with their own rope. On her way home, Helen dialed Gloria. By the time she arrived at Helen's door, Gloria was practically buzzing. She carried a bakery box so large Helen laughed before even opening it. I told you, didn't I? Gloria announced, pulling out 2 oversized slices of lemon meringue pie. The sugary scent filled the kitchen, bright and sweet. When fools broadcast their nastiness, all you have to do is keep receipts. Helen chuckled as she cut into her slice, the fork clinking against the plate. The cream melted on her tongue, tart and airy, while Gloria carried on, waving her fork for emphasis. You've got the bank secured, you've got your lawyer in your corner, and now you've got black and white proof of her spite. That's what I call a winning streak. For the first time in weeks, Helen laughed without restraint. The sound surprised her, filling the kitchen and spilling out into the quiet house. She laughed until her eyes watered and her shoulders shook. Gloria joined in, the 2 women leaning against each other like girls sharing a secret joke. That evening, Helen sat with Mark in the den. The TV murmured in the background, but neither of them was watching. Mark turned toward her suddenly, his expression oddly searching. Mom, he said, voice low, why are you so cheerful lately? Helen studied him for a moment. He looked worn, as if caught in a storm he didn't know how to navigate. His tie hung loose around his neck, his eyes shadowed with guilt. She considered her words carefully, her smile faint but steady. Because Mark, I finally feel like myself again. He didn't push further, but the unease in his posture told her he noticed the shift, and didn't know what to make of it. Later, after the house fell quiet, and Helen settled into her armchair with a cup of chamomile tea, her phone buzzed. Edward's name lit up the screen. She answered, his voice calm, but deliberate. Helen, he said, I think it's time we discussed your estate plans. The words landed heavy, but not frightening. They carried possibility. Helen stared into the warm steam rising from her cup, her pulse steadying. The next battlefield wasn't just about money, it was about legacy. The rain was steady that morning, pattering against the wide windows of Edward Grant's office. Helen sat in the high-backed chair across from him, the faint scent of polished leather and ink filling the room. Outside, gray clouds rolled low over Cincinnati, but inside, Helen's resolve burned bright. Edward slid a thick folder across the desk. His calm eyes studied her carefully, as though weighing whether she fully grasped the magnitude of what she was about to do. This is the draft, he said softly. Your updated estate plan. Everything will be clear, indisputable. Helen adjusted her glasses and opened the folder. Each page was clean, precise, legal lines cutting sharper than any knife. She skimmed past the opening formalities until her eyes landed on the sections that mattered most. Charitable contributions, a senior medical fund in her name. Gloria Benson, primary beneficiary. Trusted friend. Emergency contact. Mark and Tracy Whitaker. No provision. Helen read the line twice, then a third time, letting the weight of it sink in. Edward's voice broke into her thoughts. You're sure? Helen lifted her gaze, steady and unwavering. I'm sure. They tried to take away my medicine, my life. Why should I leave them my legacy? Edward gave a single nod. Then we'll finalize it today. The pen felt heavy in her hand as she signed, but not in a burdensome way. Each stroke across the page was liberation, slicing clean through decades of assumption that family meant entitlement. With every signature, the burden she'd carried, the silence, the fear, the manipulation peeled away like old paint. When she finished, Edward stamped the last page with a firm press of his notary seal. The sharp click echoed through the office like a gavel falling. Helen sat back, exhaling deeply. Her shoulders felt lighter, as if she had put down a suitcase she'd carried too far. Just then, the office door cracked open, and Gloria slipped in, her red scarf damp from the rain. She shook it off, then marched straight to Helen's side. "Well, did you do it?" Helen turned the signed documents toward her with a small, satisfied smile. Gloria's hands clapped together with such force that Edward chuckled. "Hallelujah!" she exclaimed. "I hope you saw Tracy's face in your mind while you signed, because I sure did." Helen laughed, the sound freer than it had been in years. It wasn't about seeing her face, it was about reclaiming mine. The three of them lingered in the office a few moments longer, the rain outside softening to a mist. Helen felt a peace settling over her, rare and delicate, yet solid. She had cut the strings Tracy thought she controlled. Edward gathered the signed documents into their folder, tucking them neatly into his briefcase. His movements were deliberate, precise, until finally he closed the case with a snap. Then he looked at Helen, with a thoughtfulness that made her pause. "There's one more thing to consider," he said slowly. Helen tilted her head. "What's that?" Edward folded his hands on the desk. "When Mark and Tracy discover this, because there will be shock. There may be anger, even legal threats. What often prevents disputes is clarity. I suggest you write a personal letter, something that explains your decision, in your words, not a legal document, an emotional one, so they understand exactly why they've been excluded." Helen blinked, taken aback. The suggestion hung in the air, heavy with implication. Gloria leaned forward, eyes wide. "A letter? Oh, Helen, that'll cut deeper than money ever could." Helen's fingers brushed the edge of the desk. The thought of pouring her pain, her reasoning onto paper, both unsettled and intrigued her. A letter would strip away their excuses, force them to confront the truth they'd tried to bury under silence. Edward's gaze was steady. "Think about it. Words last longer than numbers." Helen sat still, the rain resuming its soft rhythm against the windows. Her estate was secure. Her money was safe, but her words might be the sharpest inheritance of all. Helen sat at her writing desk that night, the lamplight spilling across a fresh sheet of cream-colored stationery. Outside, the wind rustled the maple tree branches against her window, a steady whisper urging her on. She uncapped her pen and held it over the paper, her pulse steady but firm, like the beat of a drum she finally knew how to march to. The first words came slower than she expected, her script elegant yet deliberate. "Mark, Tracy." She paused, then began to write what she had carried for weeks, months, perhaps years. She wrote of Tracy's cruelty, every cutting remark that had chipped away at her dignity. She didn't exaggerate, didn't spit venom, just facts, sharp and unflinching. The night Tracy questioned the value of her medicine, the unpaid pharmacy bill, the glare across the dinner table that said Helen's life was a burden, not a bond. She wrote of Mark too, not with anger, but with sorrow. His silence, his passivity, the way he folded into himself, rather than stand up for the mother who once folded him into her arms. She wrote how enabling cruelty was not the same as being innocent. Each sentence deepened with weight, the scratch of her pen loud in the stillness of the room. Her throat tightened, but she pressed on. Then, softer lines followed. Words for Gloria. She praised her friend's unwavering loyalty, her laughter that filled empty rooms, her fierce defense that reminded Helen she was not alone. She wrote how friendship could be family too, how blood did not own that word exclusively. Finally, she explained where her money would go. Not to the ungrateful, but to a cause that mattered, a senior medical fund, one that would provide others the medicine, care and dignity she nearly lost. She described it not as revenge, but as renewal, a seed planted from pain into purpose. By the time she signed her name, her hand ached slightly, but her chest felt lighter, unburdened. She placed the pages into an envelope, sealed it with deliberate care, and wrote one word on the front in her neat cursive: truth. The next morning Helen brought the letter to Edward's office. The rich smell of coffee lingered in the hall as she walked in. Edward accepted the envelope with both hands, like it was something fragile and sacred. Lock it with the wool, Helen said. He nodded gravely, sliding it into the secure folder. They'll read this when the time comes, and there will be no mistaking why. Relief coursed through her like warmth. That night, Helen lay in bed with her quilt pulled snug to her shoulders. For the first time in months, she fell asleep without her thoughts circling like restless birds. The house creaked softly, but it felt like a lullaby, not a warning. The peace lasted until the next evening. A sharp pounding rattled her front door, the sound jarring her awake from her armchair where she had dozed. She startled upright, heart pounding, the echo of fists slamming against wood filling the hallway. Helen, Tracy's voice, high-pitched and furious, pierced the night. We need to talk about this missing money. Helen gripped the arms of her chair, her eyes narrowing. The battle had just landed on her doorstep. The pounding rattled the door so hard the picture frames on the hallway wall trembled. Helen stood in the shadows of her living room, her hands clasped loosely before her. She could see Tracy's silhouette through the frosted glass window, blurred but unmistakable, rigid posture, arms crossed between bangs of her fist. Helen. Tracy's shrill voice cut through the night. Open this door right now. We need to talk about this money. Helen didn't move. Not a word left her lips. The only sound inside was the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel and the low simmer of the kettle she had left warming on the stove. A gentle hand touched her shoulder. Gloria stood beside her, calm as stone, a steaming mug of tea in her other hand. Let her scream herself out, she whispered. Silence is sharper than any answer. The pounding grew louder, more desperate. Tracy's voice cracked with fury. You can't keep doing this. You think you're in charge, but you're not. This whole family runs because of me. Helen lifted her chin, her eyes narrowing, but her lips stayed closed. She turned away from the door, walking slowly back into the kitchen. Gloria followed, settling into a chair with her tea. The fragrant steam of chamomile and honey drifted between them, drowning out the acrid scent of Tracy's anger seeping through the walls. They sat together, sipping quietly. The contrast between the storm outside and the calm inside was almost surreal. Gloria smirked over the rim of her mug. I imagine she hates being ignored more than anything. Helen allowed herself a small knowing smile. That's the point. The banging slowed, then stopped. For a long moment, there was silence. Then the sound of heels clacking angrily down the front steps. A car door slammed. Tires screeched against pavement. Tracy was gone for now. Helen set her mug down, her hand steady. She'll be back. Then we'll be ready. Gloria replied. The next morning, Helen's phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Mark. Mom, please, can we talk? The words glowed on the screen, but Helen didn't touch it. She turned the phone over, face down on the wood, and picked up her tea instead. She had nothing to say to a man who could only plead when the dust settled, but never when it mattered. Later that day, Helen visited Edward's office. She carried herself tall, her coat buttoned neatly, despite the winter chill. Edward listened carefully as she described Tracy's late-night tirade. His hands rested folded on the desk, his expression calm and measured. You've done exactly right, he assured her. Do not open the door. Do not respond to threats. The law is squarely on your side. And remember, Tracy has no standing, not legally, not financially. Helen felt the reassurance settle into her bones like a warm blanket. Then I'll keep holding my silence. Edward gave a faint smile. Sometimes silence is the loudest testimony. That evening, Helen returned home to find the house still. The only sound the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of floorboards beneath her feet. She made herself a small supper, chicken soup with carrots, the steam carrying the comfort of familiarity. She was halfway through her meal when the phone rang. She hesitated, setting down her spoon, then picked it up. Lydia's name lit the screen. Helen. Lydia's voice was steady but urgent. Tracy tried again today. She came storming into the branch, insisting she had authority over your account. We refused her. She wasn't pleased. Helen's grip tightened around the receiver. The soup on the table cooled forgotten. Tracy wasn't finished. She was escalating. Lydia's voice carried a cool steadiness through the receiver, but Helen could hear the edges of exasperation beneath it. She came in red-faced, Lydia explained, raised her voice in the lobby, accused my staff of conspiring with you. When we reminded her she had no legal authority, she slammed her hand on the counter hard enough to rattle the pens. Helen pictured it. Tracy, her heels clicking furiously, her temper on display for strangers, her control unraveling in a public place. The image sent a small spark of satisfaction curling through her chest. Thank you, Helen said warmly, her tone softer now, for standing firm. I imagine that wasn't easy. Lydia's calm laugh floated down the line. It's my job to protect clients. But I'll admit, it's not often we get someone so determined. Don't worry, Helen. Your accounts are sealed tighter than ever. After hanging up, Helen sat back, letting the stillness of her kitchen wrap around her. The smell of fresh coffee lingered from that morning, earthy and reassuring. She allowed herself a slow breath, the sound of Tracy's tantrum echoing in her imagination, like background music to a victory dance. Not long after, Gloria arrived, as she often did in moments like these. She plopped her purse onto the table, pulled out a pack of cookies, and immediately started her performance. So she went full Godzilla at the bank? Gloria asked, widening her eyes theatrically. She raised her hands and let out a guttural roar that sent Helen into a fit of laughter. Gloria, Helen chuckled, holding her stomach. What? Gloria said with mock innocence, breaking a cookie in half. I'm just saying, if she's gonna stomp around downtown, someone ought to cue the theme music. The two women laughed until tears blurred Helen's eyes, the heaviness of the last few weeks momentarily dissolving. That evening, Helen poured herself into cooking. She diced carrots and onions, the sharp scent filling the kitchen, the sizzle of chicken in the skillet a steady companion. By the time the stew simmered rich and savory, she ladled herself a full bowl, sitting at the table with the warmth seeping through her palms. Each bite was hearty, grounding nourishment she hadn't realized she craved. Upstairs, she heard the faint shuffle of Mark's footsteps. When he finally came down, his shoulders slumped, his mouth drawn tight. He looked like a boy caught between playground bullies. "Mom," he said softly, sliding into a chair across from her. "Tracy. She's upset. She feels like you're freezing her out." Helen spooned another bite of stew, unfazed. "She upset herself. That's not my doing." Mark's eyes flicked downward. He rubbed his temples, sighing, but offered no defense for Tracy's actions. He just sat there, sulking, caught in the crossfire of loyalties he refused to navigate. Helen felt no urge to comfort him. Once, his weakness would have wounded her. Now it only looked small. Detached, she studied him the way one might study a painting long since faded, recognizable, but stripped of power to move her. "I won't apologize for protecting myself," she said quietly. Mark didn't respond. His silence, once heavy, now felt irrelevant. Later, as Helen washed her bowl in the sink, her phone buzzed against the counter. She dried her hands and answered. Edward's voice came calm and steady. "Helen, I've set a date for the final estate signing. It's time to seal everything officially." Helen stared at her reflection in the kitchen window, the city lights glowing faintly in the distance. The endgame was near. The conference room smelled faintly of leather and ink, the kind of scent that clung to permanence. Helen sat at the long mahogany table in Edward's office, the weight of a pen resting in her hand. The blinds were open just enough to let in the pale afternoon sun, casting angled stripes of light across the stack of documents before her. "This is it," Edward said gently, sliding the final version of her will across the table. "Once you sign, everything is locked. Charity, Gloria, and nothing for Mark or Tracy." Helen pressed her palm flat against the paper for a moment, feeling its smooth texture. She thought of the nights Tracy's words had cut through the house like knives. Why waste money on her medicine? She thought of Mark, always shrinking into silence, never once raising his voice to defend her. They had made their choices. Now she was making hers. With deliberate strokes, she signed her name on each page. The scratch of the pen filled the silence. Steady, final. She turned one page after another, her movements neither rushed nor hesitant, until the last signature lay in neat cursive at the bottom of the final sheet. Edward slid the papers back toward him, checked each page, then picked up his notary stamp. With a firm press, the seal imprinted onto the page, its raised edges catching the sunlight. The click of the stamp echoed in the quiet room like the sound of a door slamming shut. "It's done," Edward said simply. Helen leaned back in her chair and drew in a long breath, her chest expanding as though space had finally been returned to her lungs. The burden that had hung on her shoulders for months seemed to slip free, dissipating into the stillness of the office. Across from her, Gloria clapped her hands together softly, then reached out and squeezed Helen's. Her palm was warm, firm, grounding. "You did it, Helen. You've reclaimed everything they tried to steal from you." Helen turned to her, a small but certain smile on her lips. "I didn't just reclaim it. I redirected it to where it matters." Edward stacked the signed documents neatly, then reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a heavy envelope, sealed with an official stamp, and placed it directly in front of Helen. "This," he said, sliding it toward her, "is your certified copy. Keep it somewhere safe. It carries the word final on the cover. That means no one, not even Mark, not even Tracy, can challenge what's inside without running into a wall of law." Helen stared at the envelope. The word final was printed in bold, unmistakable type across the corner. Seeing it there sent a small shiver down her spine, not of fear but of awe. She picked it up slowly, the thick paper heavy in her hand. The letters seemed to glow in the filtered sunlight, a verdict and a victory all at once. Gloria leaned closer, her voice low but triumphant. "They don't even know it yet, but their inheritance just vanished. You've written the end of their story." Helen held the envelope against her chest, her breath steady, her heartbeat calm. For the first time in years, she felt free. But as Edward locked away the office copies, his gaze lingered on the envelope in Helen's hands. "Remember, Helen," he said quietly, "final means exactly that. There's no turning back." Helen tightened her grip on the envelope, her eyes narrowing slightly. Final, the word carried promise and danger. Helen carried the envelope home like it was made of glass. The house was silent when she stepped inside. The late afternoon sun slanting through the blinds, striping the floor in amber and shadow. She walked straight to her bedroom, unlocked the safe tucked into the bottom of her closet, and knelt. The safe smelled faintly of metal and cedar from the box it rested in. Her hands were steady as she spun the dial and tugged open the door. Inside lay only a few items: her late husband's watch, a stack of bonds, her marriage certificate. She slipped the envelope in, sliding it neatly between the bonds and the watch, then closed the door with a firm click. The sound rang through the closet like a lock on a cell. Tracy's inheritance was sealed away, out of her reach forever. Helen straightened, smoothed her skirt and breathed deeply. One copy safe here, another with Edward. Between them there wasn't a crack for Tracy to wedge her claws into. The next day she met Gloria at their cafe downtown, the one with wide windows and the smell of cinnamon rolls that always lingered in the air. They sat at their usual corner table, where they could see the people bustling along the street outside. Helen ordered 2 lattes and a slice of pecan pie to share. When the cups arrived, steam curling into the air, Gloria raised hers high. "To independence," she declared. Helen lifted her own cup, the ceramic warm against her palms. "To peace." They clinked gently, the sound soft but decisive. Then both took a sip. The coffee was rich, smooth, with a hint of caramel, better than it had tasted in months. For once Helen wasn't just drinking to get through the day, she was drinking to savor it. They lingered over pie, Gloria's laughter bubbling so easily it filled the cafe. Helen found herself laughing too, deeper and freer until her sides ached, until the young barista glanced over with a smile at their joy. Later, walking back to her car, Helen ran into 2 neighbors from her street. They greeted her warmly, asking after her health, complimenting her new scarf. Their smiles were genuine, their voices kind. She realized she wasn't carrying the shadow of Tracy's disdain anymore. She was carrying her own presence again. By the time she returned home, the house felt lighter, as though her laughter had followed her back, settling into the walls like sunlight. She put on the kettle, humming under her breath, and thought how far she had come from that first night, clutching her pill bottle in fear. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a text message. She dried her hands on a dish towel and reached for it. From Tracy. The words glared back at her, sharp as shattered glass. "You'll regret this." Helen's thumb hovered over the screen, her lips tightening into a thin line. Tracy had no idea that the final copy, the one that mattered most, was already locked away. The words pulsed like a threat, sharp and petty. She stared at them for a long moment, the silence of the house pressing around her. Then, with a calm flick of her finger, she set the phone face down on the counter. No reply. No argument. Silence was her answer. She moved slowly through her home, the rhythm of her footsteps steady against the hardwood. Each room was neat, every surface polished. The air carried the faint scent of lemon cleaner and something sweeter, Gloria's flowers from last week still fresh in a vase on the table. For once the house didn't feel like a battleground. It felt like hers again. In the kitchen, the afternoon light caught the edge of the counter where a small orange pill bottle sat. Helen picked it up, the rattle of tablets inside crisp and reassuring. Her name gleamed on the label, bold and undeniable, paid for, secured, untouchable. She set it back down carefully, almost ceremonially, like a talisman of victory. A knock at the door startled her, not the harsh pounding of Tracy's fists, but a gentle rap followed by a familiar voice. "It's just me, sugar. I brought pie." Helen smiled before she even opened the door. Gloria stepped inside, carrying a box that smelled of butter and apples, her scarf trailing loosely around her shoulders. "Thought you could use something sweet," Gloria said, setting the box on the counter. She eyed the pill bottle and raised an approving brow. "And I see you've already got the important stuff handled." Helen laughed softly. "Handled and locked tighter than Fort Knox." Gloria slid into a chair while Helen filled the kettle. The hiss of steam soon filled the room, followed by the rich scent of black tea. They cut generous slices of pie, the crust flaky and golden, the apples still warm and spiced. As they ate they talked, not about Tracy, not about Mark, not even about money. They talked about a quilting show coming to the senior center, about the cafe waitress with her bright laugh, about the spring garden Gloria insisted Helen would plant this year. Laughter came easier now. It rippled between them like music, softening the edges of everything that had come before. Helen poured a second round of tea, her hands steady, her smile unforced. When Gloria finally left, the sun had dipped low, painting the sky outside in streaks of orange and violet. Helen lingered in the kitchen, the last of the pie cooling on the counter, the pill bottle still standing tall beside it. She reached out and brushed her fingers against the smooth plastic, her chest swelling with quiet relief. For months she had lived under Tracy's shadow, her words, her schemes, her hunger for control. But now the shadow had thinned to nothing more than noise on a phone screen, a desperate echo she no longer needed to answer. Helen walked to her armchair, settled into its familiar embrace, and pulled a soft blanket over her lap. The house hummed gently around her, the tick of the clock, the faint creak of settling wood, the kettle cooling on the stove. Each sound was ordinary, but together they formed the symphony of peace. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply and smiled. "I paid for peace," she whispered to herself, "and it was worth every penny."